this is why a lot of us have trouble being alone, because when you are alone, you have to sit with your unresolved thoughts. You have to face your temptations and your insecurities. You're faced with your ego, right? You're faced with anxiety. When you step away into solitude, you're introduced to the real you. And growth requires awareness of the real you. In order to grow physically, mentally, and emotionally, right? In order to even be able to do this thing in the gym, do this thing called life, you have to be aware, right? And you have to be consistently aware of who you are, where you are, what are your temptations, what are your insecurities, right? Because in order to be prepared, right? In order to actually set yourself up for success, you have to be aware of who you are, right? So that you can do the things necessary, right, to achieve your said outcome.
Keep God first. Always have faith. With faith comes patience, because everything is not instantly gratified. And then after that, discipline.
If it's your first time checking in, this your boy Fit Man Dan. This is just a time where I come to share a few words that I hope help impact someone on their journey through life or their journey through fitness. I'm out here at the park today. It felt good outside, so I came out to the park today. As we dive into part 2 of Solitude. So on last week, we talked about solitude and how it's essential, right, for your alignment. It's essential for your recovery, and to silence the noise that consistently attempts to cloud your judgment. And so on this week, we're going to go just a little bit deeper, or we're just going to continue talking about it, not necessarily deeper, but we're going to continue talking about this principle of solitude, and hopefully we can uncover some more nuggets so that you guys and myself can actually learn something from this, so that we can actually apply this to our life practically. And so we're talking from Mark 6:31, where Jesus called the disciples away into rest. And the first thing I want to talk about this week in reference to solitude is that it reveals what's really inside of you, right? When you step away from the crowds, when you step away and you are alone with yourself, right? This is why a lot of us have trouble being alone, because when you are alone, you have to sit with your unresolved thoughts. You have to face your temptations and your insecurities. You're faced with your ego, right? You're faced with anxiety. When you step away into solitude, you're introduced to the real you. And growth requires awareness of the real you. In order to grow physically, mentally, and emotionally, right? In order to even be able to do this thing in the gym, do this thing called life, you have to be aware, right? And you have to be consistently aware of who you are, where you are, what are your temptations, what are your insecurities, right? Because in order to be prepared, right? In order to actually set yourself up for success, you have to be aware of who you are, right? So that you can do the things necessary, right, to achieve your said outcomes, right? For example, if you know you're the type of person that is very easily distracted, right? You need to be aware of that, so that when it is time for you to be focused, you are able to cultivate an environment that makes it easier for you to focus. Awareness requires silence. Awareness requires solitude. God can't refine you, right, if you don't sit still long enough. God can't reveal things to you if you don't sit, right, with those thoughts long enough, if you don't sit in those situations long enough, if you don't quiet the noise long enough. God can't reveal to you what he wants you to see. Solitude exposes your weaknesses, right? It allows you to strengthen yourself, right, in private, so that your weaknesses aren't exposed in public. And Jesus cares so much about us, right, that he 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 showed us this here in Mark, that solitude is important, so that you are aware of your vices, so that you are aware of your weaknesses, so that you can correct them and deal with them in solitude, right? Number two, what does solitude do for us? Solitude, strengthens our identity, right? When we're in crowds, when we're around other people, we tend to um, become performative. We tend to want to gain the approval of others, right? But in solitude, you're forced to sit with your true self. You're forced to remember exactly who you are, right? Jesus consistently withdrew before and after major moments. Why? Why would Jesus do that, right? And I thought about this for a while, and I began to research, like, why would Jesus, right, decide to go away and pray before he did major things? Well, here, right, in my study, I found that public affirmation can distort your true identity, right? If we connect our self-worth and our identity to the validation of others, social media, comparing ourselves in the gym, right? Comparing the amount of money we make, right? Comparing, right, sexual temptations, right? Because of our ego, because we want to appear, right, a certain type of way to other people, we begin to tie ourselves and our identity in that approval. And so it's important that you draw away in solitude, because solitude anchors you, right, as a son or daughter of God. It anchors you in that loving relationship, and not in the validation and the status that you receive from others, right? If you don't separate yourself from the applauses of others, you'll begin to perform for it. It's why so many people, right, feel the need to gain the validation from social media, because it is literally an audience at your disposal, right? Number three, solitude builds emotional regulation. And this is a really big one for growth. You must, right, in order to master your emotions, you must be a patient individual. You must be an individual capable of controlling oneself. You must be able to delay gratification and control your thoughts. I made a video on this before, thought management. It's important, right, to control your thoughts when you're attempting to grow. When you can sit, right, without stimulation, when you can sit and not be applauded, when you can sit in literal silence, you're learning to control these impulses. You're learning to not be reactive, right? You're learning to not make decisions from a place of emotion. You're able to slow yourself down, slow your emotions down, so that you're able to make calm, sound decisions, right? Solitude is literally training your nervous system. This is something that I learned too. I recently started going to, I didn't recently started going to it, but in recent years, I started going to a chiropractor, and I learned a lot about the nervous system, and how your nervous system, right, is like your true self. You can't override the nervous system. You can train your nervous system, but your nervous system will respond to its typical training, right? And so solitude trains your nervous system to be calm. It trains your nervous system to slow down and not be reactive, right? You may ask, well, what trained our nervous system up until this point? Everything that you experienced in life up until this point, right? Your childhood and how you grew up trained your nervous system. And so solitude is actually retraining it, slowing it down. Because us as peak performers, we don't react, we respond. Number 4, solitude increases spiritual sensitivity, right? When there's a lot of noise, it's harder to discern the voice of God, right? Like I said, in the Gospels, Jesus withdrew often, not because he was overwhelmed, but because Jesus was intentional. He knew that solitude was needed. He knew that he needed to go away in prayer so that he could be aligned with the Father, right? So that he can receive the Father's direction, so that he can receive the Father's correction, right? So that he was moving on God's time and not his time, right? So that he was convicted in the things that he do, that he knew without a shadow of a doubt, like God said this because I've sat in solitude and quieted the noise of my ego, quieted the noise of others, and I hear that still small voice of God, right? That's conviction. And growth in life requires listening and hearing, right, before acting, not being emotionally reactive, right? Speed without sensitivity leads to alignment. Like I said, I think I said this in the last video, moving very fast, having very short bursts of energy, right, without alignment, without being aligned with the voice of God, leads to just unproductive work, right? Solitude prevents the inflating of our ego, right? Success, right, though it is something that is good and though that God wants this for us, it can create pride, right? When you're constantly being affirmed by others, you can start to believe the hype. God knows your true identity. God knows who you are behind closed doors. And at times, right, if we're not pulled away into silence, we can drift away from humility. We can become very arrogant, egotistical individuals, right? Just because we started working out and we're seeing gains, that doesn't mean that we're operating at our peak performance. That don't mean we're doing our best. Just because we're doing a little bit better than someone that began after us, it doesn't mean that we're operating at our peak performance. That's why it's always good to surround yourself with like-minded individuals, with people that are trying to reach the heights, right? Because if you surround yourself with people that aren't necessarily trying to reach higher heights, you'll find you'll find that there's a gap, right? Where you're here and your friends are there. But what always happens in relationships, and especially if you're not drawn away into silence to really be aware of yourself and where you are and where you're going, right? This gap will close, and either they'll come up towards you or you'll go down towards them. And so humility is found in silence, right? You don't believe your own hype. You're appreciative of it, right? But you know that there's a whole lot more potential, right? And solitude really helps you to remind you that you're on your own battle, that you're being led by God, and that God is your only sustainer. You don't need the applause of others. You don't need the affirmations. You don't need the gratification. All you need is to stay aligned, because alignment, right, is like sharpening that axe. And when you are aligned, your intentions will pierce and make the impact that you want them to make, right? And lastly, solitude protects your longevity. We were just talking about this, having endurance, right? If you train as hard as I do, you train athletic. You train like an athlete, right? And so athletes don't just train for strength. They don't just train to be fast, but they train for endurance, right? Because true athletes know that, yes, I want to be fast, but I want my speed to last too, because I'm playing for however many minutes this game lasts or this tournament lasts. And so Jesus ministered to us a whole lot, right? And he was able to last. All of the impact that he made, right? He was able to last and not burn out. Some teachers burn out. Some spiritual leaders, they burn out. Pastors burn out, right? Coaches burn out. Teachers burn out. Why? Because it takes a whole lot, right, to preserve your mental health. If you aren't, right, aligned with the way Jesus said to restore yourself, which is solitude, right? If you are constantly being burdened by the performance of your work, of your career, of your training, of your relationships, and you don't take time to be refueled, right? It leads to mental exhaustion, and it actually makes it harder for you to do the things that God wants you to do. So I'm gonna leave you with this. Intensity builds moments, rhythms build legacy. Isolation is you escaping from your responsibility. Solitude, on the other hand, is you intentionally withdrawing yourself for refinement. I want to leave you with some action items as I wrap up solitude today. To over the next 30 days, right? Or let's start with something that's actually tangible. Over your next week, right? In the next 7 days, I want you to measure 30 to 60 minutes of silence each and every day, where you silence your notifications, you draw away from the crowds, you come away into some place like the park, maybe. Some place, if you're by the water, go by the beach, maybe. Maybe you can find a quiet place there, but go into a quiet place, right? Leave your phone if you have to. Leave the books. Go away and just connect with God. Just be with him, right? And I think that you shall receive that peace and that rest that Jesus is attempting to draw us into here in Mark 6:31. Peace and blessings, y'all. I'll see y'all on the next one.